There is a specific kind of grief that has no funeral, no mourners, no date marked on a calendar. It is the grief of a man who realizes, too late, that the person he shared a roof with for 3 years was someone he never actually met. Edmund, Duke of Ashford, returned to Thornwell Manor after 12 years away, expecting to find an empty house and an uncomplicated silence. What he found instead changed everything he thought he knew about the years he had wasted and about the woman he had never allowed himself to see. This is not a story about death. It is a story about all the living that happens inside a silence, and about what a man discovers when he finally stops running long enough to face what was left behind. The carriage stopped at the iron gate just as the last light of evening disappeared behind the hills. 12 years. That was how long he had been away from Thornwell Manor, first to the battlefields of the continent, then to the cold halls of political obligation in the capital, and finally to a silence he had chosen deliberately, the kind of silence only a man running from something truly understands. He stepped down from the carriage without a word, his boots pressing into the gravel path, as if testing whether the ground would still hold him. The estate looked exactly as he had left it, and nothing like it at all. The hedges had grown taller, the stone facade had darkened with age and rain. The windows reflected the gray sky like eyes that had stopped expecting anything. 2 servants stood at the entrance, their faces a mixture of duty and something Edmund could not quite name. Not welcome, not resentment. Something quieter than both. Something that felt uncomfortably like pity. He walked through the front door and stopped in the entrance hall. The chandelier above him was unlit. The portraits along the staircase watched him in silence. And somewhere deep inside the house, something felt wrong. Not broken, not cold, but suspended, as if the manor itself had been holding its breath since the day she died, waiting for him to finally come back and face what he had left behind. His study was the first room he entered. Old habit. In this house, the study had always been the one place that belonged entirely to him, the one room where no one entered without permission, where silence was not loneliness but order. He pushed the door open, expecting dust and darkness. Instead, the fireplace was lit. The curtains had been drawn back to let in the last gray light, and there, on the center of his mahogany desk, was a small book bound in faded green leather. Open. Edmund did not move for a long moment. He recognized the book immediately, not because he had seen it often, but because he had seen it once, years ago, in her hands, pressed against her chest as she walked quickly away from him down a corridor she thought he wasn't watching. He had never asked what it was. He had never asked her much of anything. He crossed the room slowly, as if the floor between him and the desk had suddenly become uncertain ground, and looked down at the open pages. The handwriting was hers, small, precise letters leaning slightly to the right, the kind of penmanship that revealed a woman who had been taught to be careful with everything, including her words. The ink had faded to a soft brown at the edges, but the lines were still perfectly legible. His eyes caught only the last 3 words on the open page before he looked away. 3 words that made him pull out the chair and sit down heavily. Not because he was tired from the journey, but because something in his chest had just shifted in a way he was entirely unprepared for. Her name had been Cecily. He had known that much. He had known her family name, her age at the time of the arrangement, the size of the dowry, and the date of the ceremony. He had stood beside her at the altar of St. George's on a cold March morning and spoken the required words in a clear, composed voice. And when the vicar had pronounced them bound, Edmund had looked at her, truly looked at her, for perhaps the first time. She had been pale. Her eyes, he remembered now, were a shade of gray-green he had never seen before or since. What he had not done, in the months that followed, was learn her. He had been polite, distant in the way that powerful men often mistake for dignity. He had greeted her at dinner when he was present, which was rarely. He had acknowledged her management of the household with a single approving nod each season. He had never asked what she read, what she feared, what made her laugh when no one was watching. He had given her a title, a house full of servants, and an absence so complete it must have felt to her like living beside a locked door. And yet, she had stayed. She had not complained to her family. She had not sought sympathy from the ladies of the county. She had run Thornwell Manor with quiet precision, earned the loyalty of every servant within its walls, and written apparently in a small green diary she kept close, filling pages he had never been meant to read with the interior life of a woman he had never truly known. The thought settled over him like a cold fog. He had shared a name with her for 3 years before she died, and he was only now beginning to wonder who she had been. Edmund had told himself over the years that his absence from Thornwell was practical. There had been the campaign in the South, which had lasted 14 months and cost him 2 close friends and the hearing in his left ear. There had been the political appointments that followed, the kind that carry enough importance to justify almost any personal neglect. And then there had been the news, delivered by letter in 3 short lines from the estate's solicitor, that his wife had passed quietly in the night, a fever that moved too fast for the physician to stop. He had read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. He had not returned for the burial. He had sent a formal letter of condolence to her family and a generous sum to cover arrangements, and he had continued the work in front of him, because the work was always there, and it had always been easier to face than anything that required him to feel something he could not control. Those who knew him well, and there were very few, understood that Edmund did not grieve loudly. Those who knew him less assumed he had not grieved at all. What no one knew was that the night he received the letter, he had sat alone in his study in the capital until nearly 4 a.m, staring at nothing, feeling the particular weight of a guilt he could not fully name, because naming it would have required admitting something he was not yet ready to admit: that he had wasted her. That he had taken a living, feeling, thinking woman and turned her, through sheer indifference, into a background detail of his own life. 12 years had passed, and sitting now in his study at Thornwell, with her diary open on his desk, he understood that he had never stopped carrying that weight. He had only learned to walk with it. He believed the diary was the hardest thing she had left behind. He was wrong. Because somewhere inside that house there was still a sealed letter with his name on it, written in her hand, never delivered, waiting 12 years for him to come back, and what was written inside it would not simply break him. It would remake him entirely. Stay with this story. He did not read it that first night. He closed the diary carefully, placed his hand flat on the cover for a moment as if making some unspoken agreement with it, and then set it to the side and called for supper. He ate alone, as he always had in this house, at the long dining table with its empty chairs and its silver candlesticks that Cecily had chosen herself, he now noticed, because they were simple and elegant rather than ornate and expensive, a choice that said something about her that he was only now equipped to hear. He returned to the diary at midnight, when the house was still and the fire had burned low. He opened it to the first page. The first entry was dated 3 weeks after their wedding. The handwriting was slightly unsteady at the top, as if she had started and stopped several times before finding her way into the words. She did not write with bitterness. That was the first thing that struck him. The complete absence of complaint in her tone, which somehow made it worse. She wrote the way someone writes when they have accepted very early that no one else is going to witness their experience for them. She had written about the house, about learning its corridors, about the kindness of the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Potts, who had apparently taken it upon herself to show the new Duchess which doors stuck in winter and which windows let in draughts, and where the best light fell in the afternoon, when the west drawing-room turned golden for exactly 40 minutes before the sun moved on. She had written about sitting in that golden light with a book on her lap, listening to the house settle around her, and feeling, the word she used stopped Edmund completely, hopeful. She had still been hopeful. 3 weeks into a marriage to a man who had already begun to disappear, she had sat in the afternoon light and felt hopeful. He closed the diary again. He did not sleep that night. The arrangement between the Ashford dukedom and the Vane family had been negotiated over 2 dinners and a letter. Edmund had not been present at the first dinner. His father, still alive at the time and increasingly anxious about the succession, had handled the preliminary discussions with the efficiency of a man closing a business transaction, which was, in every meaningful sense, exactly what it was. By the time Edmund was informed that a bride had been selected, the only remaining question was the date of the ceremony. He had met Cecily twice before they married, once at a formal introduction in her family's drawing room in Bath, where she had sat across from him in a pale blue dress and answered his obligatory questions with quiet composure, and once at a dinner 3 weeks later where they had been seated beside each other and managed between them perhaps 12 minutes of genuine conversation. He had thought her pleasant, intelligent possibly, though he had not given her enough time to demonstrate it. He had noted that she did not perform nervousness the way most young women did in the presence of a man they were expected to impress. She had simply been present, watchful, and still. He had interpreted that stillness as indifference. He understood now, reading between the lines of her early diary entries, that it had been something else entirely. She had been observing him the way a careful person observes something they are about to trust their entire life to, with attention, with hope, and with a quiet dread that the thing might not prove worthy of either. She had walked into that marriage knowing it was a contract. What the diary revealed, slowly and without drama, was that she had walked in hoping it might become something more. That hope, Edmund now understood, was the most painful thing she had ever left behind. The diary entries from the first year of their marriage formed a quiet portrait of a woman in motion. Cecily had reorganized the household accounts within 2 months, identifying 3 areas of unnecessary expenditure and redirecting the funds toward the restoration of the east wing roof, which had been leaking since before Edmund's father's time. She had introduced a lending library for the estate's servants, a small wooden cabinet in the lower corridor stocked with volumes she purchased herself. She had learned the name of every person employed at Thornwell Manor within her first 6 weeks. She had also tried, the diary made clear, to reach him. Not with grand gestures or declarations. She had understood instinctively that those would only push him further behind the walls he kept so carefully maintained. She had tried in small ways. A book left on his desk that she thought might interest him, with a single line written on a slip of paper tucked inside. "I thought of you when I read Chapter 4. A question asked at dinner one evening about his years at university, genuine curiosity in her voice, which he had answered briefly and then redirected to a safer subject. A walk she had proposed one Sunday afternoon along the South Meadow path, which he had declined, citing correspondence that could, she must have known, have waited. He found the entry she wrote the evening after he declined the walk. It was only 4 lines. She did not write that she was hurt. She wrote that the primroses along the South Meadow path were at their peak that week, and that she had walked it alone, and that the light had been extraordinary, and that she had wished simply for company. 4 lines. No accusation, no self-pity, no demand. Just the quiet record of a woman learning to carry her own longing without making it anyone else's burden. Edmund read those 4 lines 3 times, and each time they cost him something he could not get back. There was one entry, dated 14 months into their marriage, that Edmund found he could not read in a single sitting. He reached the middle of the second paragraph and stopped, stood up from the desk, walked to the window, and stood there looking at the dark garden for a long time before he could make himself return. Cecily had written about an evening when Edmund had returned unexpectedly from the capital. An early return, unannounced, and she had been in the music room when she heard his carriage on the gravel. She had written about the feeling that moved through her in that moment. Not excitement exactly. She had been careful with the word, but something adjacent to it. A lifting, she called it. A brief and involuntary lifting of something she usually kept very still inside herself. She had gone to the entrance hall to greet him. He had handed his coat to the footman, acknowledged her presence with a nod and the words, "Good evening, Cecily," and walked directly to his study, where he remained until dinner. She had returned to the music room. She had sat at the piano without playing, and then she had written in the measured, unsentimental tone that Edmund was beginning to recognize as the literary equivalent of a person refusing to cry in public. "I think I must stop lifting. It costs too much each time it has to come back down." That was all. No further explanation. No continuation of the thought. Just that one sentence sitting at the bottom of the page like a stone dropped into still water, and Edmund, standing at the window of his study 12 years later, understood with absolute clarity that he had been the one who taught her to stop. His name was Mr. Graves, and he had served the Ashford household for 31 years. He was a man of 70 now, thinner than Edmund remembered, with white hair and the particular kind of dignity that belongs only to those who have spent a lifetime witnessing other people's private failures without comment. He had been the one to light the fire in the study before Edmund's arrival. He had been the one to place the diary on the desk. Edmund summoned him the morning after his first night with the diary. He did not ask immediately about the book. He asked first about the estate, the usual questions a returning landowner asks, about repairs and accounts and the state of the tenancies. Graves answered each one with precision and without embellishment. And then Edmund set down his coffee cup and looked directly at the old man and asked in a voice that came out quieter than he intended who had put the diary on his desk. Graves met his gaze without flinching. He said that he had done it himself, that the diary had been in his keeping since the Duchess passed, left with him by specific instruction, along with a sealed letter addressed to the Duke to be delivered only upon his return to Thornwell. He had kept both for 12 years, he said, because the Duke had not returned for 12 years. And he said it without reproach, which was somehow the most reproachful thing he could have said. Edmund asked about the letter. Graves reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and placed it on the desk beside the now closed diary, and Edmund understood, looking at the familiar handwriting on the envelope, that the night ahead would be the longest of his life. He found them pressed between the pages of an entry from the second spring of their marriage. 3 small sprigs of primrose, flattened to near transparency with age, their yellow color faded to the palest gold. Barely there, like something that had almost finished becoming a memory. They had been placed carefully between the pages, not dropped in accidentally, but arranged with the quiet intentionality of someone who understood that small things preserved with care outlast almost everything else. The entry beside them was brief. Cecily had written that she had walked the South Meadow path again that morning, earlier than usual, before the rest of the household was awake. She had found the primroses in full bloom along the lower bank, and had stood among them for a long time, not thinking about anything in particular, just standing in the cool spring air with the light coming low across the grass. She had picked 3 sprigs to press into the diary, she wrote, because she wanted to keep something from that morning. Because some mornings, she wrote, feel too good to leave entirely behind. Edmund held the page open and looked at the dried flowers for a long time. They were fragile enough that touching them would likely reduce them to dust. He did not touch them. He simply looked at the care with which she had placed them, at the faded color that had once been vivid, at the evidence of a woman who had found genuine joy in a morning walk and had thought to preserve it, not for anyone else, but simply because the moment had been worth keeping. He had been in the capital that spring. He had not known the primroses were in bloom. He had not known she walked that path alone before the house woke up. He had not known any of it, and the weight of that particular ignorance felt, sitting there at midnight with dried flowers on the page before him, like the heaviest thing he had ever carried. The diary had already taken more from him than he thought he had left to give. But he still had not opened the letter, and he still did not know who had placed the diary on his desk, or why that person had waited 12 years to do it. Both answers were coming, and neither one would leave him the same man who had stepped off that carriage. The entries changed somewhere in the middle of the second year. Edmund noticed it the way you notice a shift in weather before you can name what has changed. Something in the atmosphere of the writing, a subtle turning of the light. The early entries had carried within them, beneath all their careful restraint, a thread of anticipation, a leaning forward, the writing of a woman who had not yet closed a particular door inside herself. That thread, he realized, was gone. She did not write about him less. In some ways, she wrote about him more, but differently, the way one writes about a landscape rather than a person. Noting his presence or absence with the same calm detachment she applied to the weather or the state of the garden. The Duke returned from London on Thursday. He looks tired. I left soup outside his study door. It was gone by morning. No hope attached to the gesture. No checking to see if the absence of the bowl meant anything. Just the simple record of an act of care offered without expectation, because expectation had become too expensive to maintain. What had replaced it was something Edmund found in certain ways even harder to read than the longing. She had turned inward, not in the way of a woman defeated, but in the way of a woman who had decided, quietly and without bitterness, to build a life that did not depend on being witnessed by the one person who should have been watching. She had expanded her correspondence with a childhood friend in Edinburgh. She had begun teaching herself botanical illustration, filling the margins of her diary with small, precise drawings of whatever was growing in the garden that week. She had started, apparently, writing letters to the tenants' families during difficult seasons. She had stopped waiting for Edmund to become her life, and had simply, with remarkable grace, begun living it. The final entry in the diary was dated the 14th of November. Edmund knew, because he had made himself find out from Graves before he reached this page, that she had died on the 15th, which meant that this entry, these words, this handwriting, this ink pressed into this particular page, was the last thing Cecily had ever written. He sat with that knowledge for several minutes before he allowed himself to read. The entry was longer than most. Her handwriting was slightly looser than usual, which he had learned to recognize over the course of reading the diary as the sign that she was writing late at night when the house was quiet and her careful daytime composure had softened into something more unguarded. She wrote about the garden. The last of the autumn roses had finally gone, she noted, and the beds were bare now, ready for winter, which she had always found oddly beautiful, the stripped-back honesty of a garden between seasons. She wrote about a letter she had received that week from her friend in Edinburgh, full of news about a new exhibition at the gallery there, and how she had laughed aloud in the sitting room and startled the cat. And then, near the bottom of the page, she wrote about Edmund. Not with grief, not with anger, not with the careful, neutral tone she had adopted in the middle years. She wrote about him with something that could only be described as tenderness, a clear-eyed, unsentimental tenderness that had apparently survived everything, all the silences and the empty chairs and the doors that never opened. She wrote that she had seen him once, years ago, in the garden at dawn, standing very still near the old oak tree, looking at nothing in particular, and that there had been something in his face in that unguarded moment, something he would never have allowed anyone to witness deliberately, that had told her everything she needed to know about why he was the way he was. She did not elaborate. She simply wrote, "I have never stopped hoping that he finds his way back, not to me, just back, to himself, to something warm, to the life that is still waiting for him whether he believes in it or not." She had hoped for him, even at the end, even after everything. She had hoped for him. His name appeared throughout the diary 114 times. Edmund knew this because, somewhere around the third night of reading, he had begun counting without fully realizing he was doing it. And by the end, the number had lodged itself in him like a splinter, precise and impossible to ignore. 114 times. In 3 years of marriage and a diary that spanned every season of those years, she had written his name 114 times. What struck him was not the frequency, but the way she wrote it. Never my husband, never the Duke, never the cold, formal distance that would have been entirely understandable given the nature of their arrangement. Always Edmund, his given name, written with the same care she applied to everything. The botanical drawings, the primroses, the 4-line entries that said everything by saying almost nothing. There was an intimacy in that small choice that he had never earned, and that she had extended anyway, as if she had decided, privately and without his knowledge, to love him by name, even when she could not love him in person. He found one entry from the 3rd winter, where she had written his name and then crossed it out and written it again immediately below, as if the first version hadn't felt right, and she had needed to try again. The crossed-out version and the rewritten version were identical. Edmund stared at that for a long time, at the evidence of a woman pausing over the writing of his name, finding it insufficient, and then discovering that there was no better version, that it was simply his name, and she was simply going to keep writing it. 114 times, in a diary he had never been meant to read, in a house he had abandoned, by a woman he had never deserved. The envelope Graves had placed on his desk was sealed with plain wax. No crest, no formality, just the kind of seal a person uses when the letter is private rather than official. His name on the front was written in the same hand as the diary, and Edmund held it for the better part of an hour before he opened it. He was not, he realized, afraid of what it would say. He was afraid of what it would cost him to read it and not be able to respond. The letter was 2 pages. She had written it, she explained in the opening lines, not as a farewell and not as an accusation, but as something she owed herself. The act of saying plainly to the one person it concerned what she had spent 3 years writing around the edges of in a small green diary. She wrote that she had not been unhappy. She was careful to make that distinction, not unhappy, but incomplete, which she said was an entirely different condition and one she had come to accept as simply the shape of the life she had been given. She had found meaning in the house, in the tenants, in the garden, in the letters to Edinburgh, in the small library in the lower corridor that had apparently become quite popular among the staff. She wrote, near the end, that she did not blame him, that she had spent considerable time deciding whether she did and had concluded honestly that she did not, that he was a man built by forces she had only partially glimpsed, and that people built by certain forces could not always be expected to dismantle them alone. She said she hoped, with the same quiet persistence that ran through every page of the diary, that he would one day allow someone to know him. Not for her sake, she was clear about that, but for his own. And she closed the letter not with love exactly, but with something that carried more weight than love, with the words, "You were worth knowing, Edmund. I only wish you had believed it yourself," he asked Graves the following morning. Not accusingly. The old man had already answered the most important question by placing the diary there at all. But because Edmund needed to understand the full shape of what had happened, the way you need to understand a wound completely before you can begin to think about what it means. Graves told him that the diary had arrived in his keeping on the morning after the Duchess passed, delivered by her personal maid, along with the sealed letter and a brief verbal message. That both items were to be kept safely and given to the Duke upon his return to Thornwell, not sent to him in the capital, not forwarded through an intermediary, but placed in his hands, or on his desk, only when he came back to the house himself. Cecily had apparently given these instructions several weeks before she died, during a period when she had been well enough to attend to such matters, but clear-eyed enough to attend to them. Edmund sat with this information quietly. She had known or suspected that she might not recover, and in the time she had to make arrangements, she had thought of him, not to punish him, not to deliver a final verdict on their marriage, but to give him something, a chance to know her, a chance she had understood with the particular lucidity of someone approaching an ending that he might never have sought on his own. She had arranged her own posthumous introduction. She had decided, even from that distance, even then, to give him one more opportunity to see her. And in doing so, Edmund understood. She had also given him the only thing that might save him from becoming entirely the man he had been building himself into for most of his adult life. He now knew who had placed the diary on his desk. He now knew what the letter said. But there was still one thing left inside that house that he had not yet found. Something she had built with her own hands, planned in secret, and left standing in the grounds of Thornwell, knowing she would never see it reach its full form. And when Graves finally took him there the following morning, Edmund understood that everything he had read had only been preparation for this last thing she had left him. Keep watching. Edmund did not sleep the night after reading the letter. He sat in the study until the fire went out and the room turned cold, and he did not move to rebuild it. He had spent 12 years constructing a version of himself that required very little warmth, little connection, little of anything that could be taken away. He had called it discipline. He had called it focus. He had called it the necessary character of a man with responsibilities too large for sentiment. Sitting in the cold study with the letter in his hands and the diary closed on the desk beside him, he understood for the first time what it had actually been. It had been fear. 12 years of very elegantly dressed fear. His own history had built the walls long before Cecily arrived. A father who expressed approval only through silence and disappointment, only through speech. A boyhood in which emotion was treated as a form of weakness so consistently that he had learned, before he was old enough to question the lesson, to keep everything essential hidden. Ambitions, doubts, grief, longing, all of it pressed down and stored somewhere he did not visit. He had carried that architecture into their marriage without examination, the way people carry the furniture of childhood into adult rooms without asking whether it belongs there. He had not been cold to Cecily because he did not care. He had been cold because caring had always, in his experience, preceded loss. The price of that particular self-protection had been her. Not her death. He was not so dishonest with himself as to claim direct responsibility for that. But her loneliness. The 114 times she had written his name in a book he never read, the primroses she had carried home alone, the lifting she had trained herself to stop, the letter she had sealed in plain wax and left with a servant, hoping that one day he would come back to the house and be ready to receive it. He had made a choice 12 years ago, and every day before and after it, to remain unreachable. And the price of that choice had a name, and the name was written 114 times in faded ink in a small green book on his desk. Graves took him to the east garden on the fourth morning. Edmund had not asked to go. The old man had simply appeared at the study door after breakfast and said quietly that there was something the Duke ought to see before he made any decisions about the estate's future. Edmund had followed without question, because Graves had spent 31 years earning the right to be followed without question. The east garden had been an overgrown utility yard when Cecily arrived at Thornwell. Edmund had known this in the abstract. It appeared in old estate records as a kitchen garden gone to neglect. But he had never paid it particular attention. What he walked into that morning was something else entirely. Whoever had maintained the grounds in the years since her death had done so with evident care, following, Graves explained, a detailed plan that the Duchess had left with the head gardener during the last autumn of her life. Roses along the south-facing wall, not yet at their peak for the season, but clearly established and thriving. A long border of perennials that would, Graves said, bloom in sequence from early spring through late autumn. An old stone bench positioned to catch the afternoon light. And along the eastern path, planted in 2 long rows, Primroses. Edmund stood among them for a long time without speaking. She had planned this garden knowing, at some level, that she might not live to see it reach its full form. She had chosen plants that would take years to establish, had drawn plans for a space she might never walk through in full bloom, and had left those plans in careful writing for the gardener to follow after she was gone. It was, he understood standing there in the morning light, the most articulate thing she had ever said to him. More articulate than the diary, more articulate even than the letter. She had planted something living in the ground of his estate and made sure it would survive her, because she had wanted something of hers to still be growing in his world long after she left it. He bent down and touched one of the primrose leaves very carefully, the way you touch something you should have been tending all along. On the final page of the diary, after the last entry, there was something Edmund had almost missed. A small folded piece of paper tucked into the inside back cover, so flat against the leather that it had escaped his notice until he held the book at an angle in the morning light and noticed the slight irregularity of the binding. He unfolded it carefully, aware that the paper was thin and old, and that carelessness now would be a final, irreversible kind of failure. It was a list, written in her hand in the same small, precise letters he had come to know over 4 nights of reading, but with a lightness to the script that felt different from the diary, less careful, more immediate, as if she had written it quickly in a moment of clarity rather than deliberation. At the top, she had written simply, "Things I wanted him to know." There were 11 items. Some were small. That she had found his copy of Marcus Aurelius in the library and read the passages he had underlined and thought, reading them, that she understood him slightly better. That the cat, whose name was apparently Pemberton, had taken to sleeping on the chair in the study when Edmund was away, as if keeping his place warm. That she had laughed once at something Edmund had said at dinner, a dry, offhand remark that he had clearly not intended as a joke, and had pressed her napkin to her mouth to hide it, and that it had been one of her favorite small moments of their marriage. But some items on the list were larger. That she had never regretted coming to Thornwell, that the house had become genuinely her home, that the life she had built within it, the library, the garden, the tenants she had come to know by name, the letters to Edinburgh, the botanical drawings, the long walks on the South Meadow path, had been, in its own particular way, a full life, and she was grateful for it. And the final item, written at the bottom of the list and underlined once, lightly, "Tell him the garden is his now. I planted it for him. I hope he sits in it." Edmund sat in the east garden that afternoon for a long time. He had carried the list outside with him, tucked inside his coat pocket, close enough to be aware of its presence without needing to read it again. The day was mild for the season, a pale sun moving slowly through thin cloud, and the garden was quiet, except for the occasional sound of birds in the rose-briars and the distant movement of the estate going about its morning. He sat on the stone bench she had positioned to catch the afternoon light, and he waited for the light to find him. He had arrived too late. That was simply true, and he had stopped trying to construct an argument against it sometime in the small hours of the previous night. He had been given 3 years with a woman of uncommon grace and intelligence and quiet courage, and he had spent those years absent in every sense that mattered, and she had died without ever hearing from him the things that a person ought to hear from the one they have chosen to build a life beside. He could not undo that. The diary, the letter, the list, the garden, none of it offered him absolution, and he understood, reading Cecily clearly for the first time, that she had not intended it to. She had not left these things as a pardon. She had left them as a gift, the gift of being known by someone, even posthumously, even imperfectly, even far too late. What he could do, what he understood, sitting in the afternoon light among the primroses she had planted for him, was the only worthy response to everything she had given, was become finally the man she had seen in that unguarded moment by the oak tree at dawn, the man she had written about in the last entry of her diary with clear-eyed tenderness, The man she had believed was in there, beneath the walls and the silence and the 12 years of elegant, disciplined fear. He could not love her now, but he could let her have been right about him. He could open the doors he had spent a lifetime keeping shut. He could learn the names of the tenants the way she had. He could read the books she had left on the shelves with her marginal notes still in them. He could sit in the garden she had planted and let it be, as she had intended it to be, a living thing in his care. He could stop running. He could come home, not to her because she was gone, but to the version of himself she had always believed existed, the one who was, she had written, worth knowing. The afternoon light reached the bench. Edmund closed his eyes, turned his face toward it, and for the first time in 12 years, stayed still. And so the Duke of Ashford remained at Thornwell, not haunted by what he had lost, but shaped by it, slowly, the way gardens are shaped, the way light moves, the way a man becomes worthy of a story that was written about him long before he was ready to read it. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about the diary, the garden, the dried primroses, the letter sealed in plain wax, then you already know what kind of stories live here. Stories about people who love quietly and are seen too late. Stories about grace offered without guarantee of return. Stories about the long, difficult, worthwhile work of becoming someone worthy of being known. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And if someone in your life needs to hear a story like this today, share it with them. Some stories are meant to find the right person at the right moment.